Thomas Friedman, three-time Pulitzer Prize winner, friend and mentor for many of us. And I don't think you find anyone in this room who doesn't follow his column in the New York Times. So Tom, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, Andreas, thank you very much. What a treat to be able to talk to this incredible OECD audience, and I wish I were there in person. What I'm going to talk about today is really a book I'm working on. It's called How to Write a Column. But what does that have to do with education? Well, the book is really about why I write, how I learn, what is the most important lesson I learned, and what did I see these 40 years in terms of big tectonic shifts that that require us to reshape how we think about education today. So let me just jump right in. Why do I write? I write for two primary reasons. First of all, I write to learn. I actually learn by writing. I always tell people I don't write my books, I actually discover my books. I start out with the kernel of an idea, and then I chip away at this sort of block of granite, and then I see an elbow or an ear or a tail, and I continue to chip away. And so for me, writing and learning go together intimately. I've never started a book where I had a perfect outline and went through it. I've discovered my books through the process of writing. Secondly, I write because I love to teach. And teaching for me as a columnist is actually a moral enterprise. It's actually the source of my idealism. Why is that? I live by the motto of Marie Curie, that now is the time to understand more so we may fear less. Now is the time to understand more so we may fear less. I believe we're living in an age where it's become an industry, a giant industry to make people frightened, stupid, and angry. Unfortunately, it's a big business today. And therefore, I see as my idealistic enterprise, basically trying to explain the world to people so they will understand more and fear less. When people ask me what I do for a living, I tell them I'm a translator from English to English. I take really complex subjects, break them down, first of all, so I can understand, whether it's globalization or technology, and then hopefully I can make it understandable to more and more people so they will understand more and fear less in an age where social networks want us to fear more, basically, and understand less. So that's basically why I write. How do I learn? Everyone learns differently. But I developed a way of learning as a columnist. I didn't understand this 40 years ago when I started. I only understood this looking back. But I developed the following way of learning. I went to the edge, the outer edge of three different realms, because it's at the edge where all the best learning happens. And it's at the edge where you get to see things first often, and which is important as a columnist and a journalist. It feels kind of flat out here, out in the edge. So I went to the edge of three different realms. The first edge I went to was to the edge of human behavior. I lived in a civil war in Beirut for 5 years, from 1979 to 1984. And living in a civil war, I got to see how human molecules behave at extremely high temperatures. I learned more about myself and what other humans are capable of for both good and ill in those 5 years in Beirut than all 45 years since then. So first of all, Beirut taught me to be an anthropologist because in Beirut, there was no data. The only data was talking to another human being. And it really instilled in me the learning skill of when you want to learn something, don't access a computer and look for the data. Actually go out and talk to people, because it turns out that talking to people is actually another form of data. So that was the first edge I went to. Second edge I went to was the edge of technology. So I'm actually the foreign affairs columnist for the New York Times, but what I would do is I would go to companies, big companies around the world, Microsoft, Intel, Infosys in India, AT&T, and I would tell their leaders, I'm not interested in your stock price, your quarterly earnings, your annual revenues, or your next CEO. I just want to do two things. I want to hang out in your research lab. I want to know what's going on at the tip of your spear. Because if you want to understand the future, hang out with the people who are inventing it. And then I want to hang out in your human relations department. I want to know how you're training your people for the future you're inventing. Because my intuition was that's coming to a neighborhood near me. And that's what brought me back in 2004 to a company in India called Infosys. I spent time in their research lab. and their human resources department, and interviewed their CEO at the end of the day. And he said to me, Tom, I've got to tell you, the global economic playing field is being leveled. The global economic playing field is being leveled, and you Americans are not ready. Oh, I wrote that down on my little laptop. The global economic playing field is being leveled. Well, we did the interview. I thought about it a lot afterwards. I was in my Jeep going back to my hotel for about an hour, and I rolled it over in my mind what he was telling me. The global economic playing field is being leveled. I realized that he was telling me the global economic playing field was being flattened. And then I realized that India's premier engineer entrepreneur was telling me the world is flat. And I wrote that down in my notebook back there in 2004 on that ride back from Emphasis. I got to my hotel. I ran up to my bedroom. I called my wife in Bethesda, Maryland, and said, honey, I'm going to write a book called The World is Flat. Well, she now says she thought that was a brilliant idea. It's not exactly how I remember the conversation at the time. But I wrote that book in 2004. I wrote The World is Flat 3 years before the iPhone was invented, 3 years before Facebook, 3 years before Twitter. And that was because I was hanging out on the edge of the story and learning from people on the edge, and therefore able to name things first. The last edge I went to is the edge of nature. So I spent the last 25 years traveling to all the world's most pristine and endangered ecosystems. From the Amazon to the rainforests of Indonesia. The U.S. Navy even took me on a submarine underneath the Arctic to study ice flows. Been a fantastic experience. I did it first in order to learn about nature, and then I did it to learn from nature, because I came to realize that this globalization system I was describing was so complex and intertwined. There was only one other thing that mirrored its complexity, and that was the natural world. So if you understood what made for a stable ecosystem in nature when the climate changes, and that's complex adaptive networks where all the elements of the ecosystem network together to maximize their resilience and propulsion, it might actually give you an insight into what makes for a stable community when the climate changes, which I argue are complex adaptive coalitions. And so those are the three edges I went to. And then what I did was my design innovation was to arbitrage them all together and to always look at the world in this 3D. What's going on with human behavior, what's going on in business, and what's going on in nature. So I actually got my BA in Arabic and graduate degree in Arabic from Oxford in 1978. So what am I doing here talking to the OECD about education? Well, basically what happened was I got my BA in Arabic in 78. And if we were able to go back in history and pluck that version of me and bring him here today, and asked him what just happened in Syria over the last decade, that 1978 version of me would have given you a very one-dimensional answer. I would have told you that Syria just had a coup. It was like the coup they had in '56. I would have given you a very, very one-dimensional answer. If you ask this 2022 version of me, here's what I will tell you happened in Syria. Syria had the worst drought in its modern history between 2006 and 2010. 1 million Syrian farmers and herders left their homes, flocked to the cities, overwhelmed the infrastructure. Assad did nothing for them. Then they got on these babies, okay, and they watched the revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt, and then they blew the lid off the place. It was the market, Mother Nature, and Moore's Law all converging. And if you aren't bringing the perspective of nature, of technology, and human behavior together, you'll actually never be able to explain the story. So that's how I learned, and I bring that 3D perspective to everything I look at today. What's the biggest lesson I learned? I learned actually two big lessons. The first is that my title, as I said, is Foreign Affairs Columnist for the New York Times. But 5 years ago, I changed my business card. It now says New York Times Humiliation and Dignity Correspondent. New York Times Humiliation and Dignity Correspondent, because I've actually realized I spent my last 40 years covering people acting out on their sense of humiliation and questing for dignity, whether it was Palestinians versus Israelis, Muslim youth in Europe versus the white Christian majority, Russia after the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, China after what it called a century of humiliation. All I do is cover people acting out on their sense of humiliation and questing for dignity. Those are the two most powerful human emotions. And of course, what's the biggest cure for humiliation? It's education. Second big lesson I learned is that, and it's the name of my book, what you say when you listen. What you say when you listen. What you say when you listen. Because one thing I learned as a reporter is that there are two things that happen when you listen. One is what you learn when you listen. All the stories I got wrong were because I was talking when I should have been listening. But secondly, and most importantly, is what you say when you listen. Listening is a sign of respect. And it's amazing what people will let you say to them if they think you respect them. If they don't think you respect them, you can't tell them the sun is shining. If they think you respect them, it's amazing what they will let you say, ask, and even challenge in them. So those are some of the biggest lessons I learned. What did I see? And this gets us to the heart of your conference here. Okay, my view is that history moves forward in what I call Promethean moments. So Prometheus was the mythical god who stole fire from a closet on Mount Olympus and gave it to humans to build civilization. And we go through these Promethean moments in history when we get the introduction of a new tool or way of thinking that forces us not to just change one thing, we have to change everything. How we work, how we learn, how we teach, how we do commerce, how we govern, how we fight wars, how we commit crimes, and how we deter crimes. So we know what these Promethean moments are. They're the printing press, they're the scientific revolution, they're the agricultural revolution, they're the industrial revolution, and this moment we're going through right now. We are living through a Promethean moment. You are ministers of education at the most challenging time in history, at a Promethean moment, when we don't just get to change one thing, we have to change everything. Now, how did I come to this conclusion? Well, I came to this conclusion by actually following politics and noticing that every major political party in the industrial world has either blown up or was blowing up in the last decade. Whether it was the Tories in England who became a Brexit party, the Liberals there disappeared, Labour became Marxist, Republicans became a Trump cult, Democrats in America are blowing up before your eyes. France is the only country in the world that has a leader without a party and an opposition without a leader. I have no idea who governs Italy today, but I don't think they're called Christian Democrats anymore. Wow, something's happened, okay? All these industrial age political parties have blown up. Now, why is that? Well, I would argue those parties were a response to the last Promethean moment, the Industrial Revolution. And what happened with the Industrial Revolution is that it was so destabilizing when the Industrial Revolution met capitalism that it took us a century to figure out how to get the best out of it and cushion the worst. And what we eventually settled on was this thing we called the welfare state. The welfare state. That was the best way we could get more people to get the best out of the Industrial Revolution and cushion the worst. And the welfare state had many different models. It had a Chinese version, a Russian version, an Eastern European version, a Western European version, and what we called an American New Deal version. And this welfare state was a set of walls, ceilings, and floors that helped and enabled workers to get the best and cushion the worst from the Industrial Revolution. And what was left-right politics was basically just a debate about how high the walls should be. Left said high walls, right said low walls. How thick the floor, the safety net should be. Left said thick floor, right said thin floor. And how tight the ceiling should be. The ceiling was on the pace of change. Left said linear, right said nonlinear. And on incomes, left said low ceiling, right said no ceiling. That framework, those walls, ceilings, and floors, basically shaped our politics for the last 75 years. And that debate between left and right, right and left. And then one day we woke up in the last few years and suddenly, kaboom, an energy release happened that blew off the ceiling, blew down the walls, and crashed through the floor. And suddenly all these binary left-right parties were at sea. They were no longer fit for purpose. So what happened? What happened was two giant releases of energy. The first was a technological energy release. It was our ability to sense, digitize, connect, process, learn, share, act. We are embedding into everything now the ability to sense, digitize, connect, process that information increasingly with artificial intelligence, learn from it, and then act on it. That's going into your toaster now, which has a microchip that you can adjust to exactly the how you like your toast, to a F-35 fighter jet that is constantly sensing its environment, digitizing that information, putting it in a computer and processing it, sharing it with the other jets in its squadron, and then acting on it. That ability to sense, digitize, connect, process, learn, share, act is going into everything. When I speak to you in 5 years, it'll be in the chairs you're sitting in, and that will tell me if this was the part of the speech that you found boring or the part where you started shifting your weight, okay? That is an incredible release of energy. At the same time, what's unique about our Promethean moment is it isn't just about a new tool, it's accompanied by an environmental energy release. Emissions, warming, ice melt, change in ocean currents, change in wind currents, extreme weather. We're in the middle of two giant super cycles at once, and these super cycles don't just change in a linear fashion, they change in a non-linear fashion. And that release of energy has basically blown up everyone's politics. It blew off the ceiling, blew down the walls, crashed through the floor, and made our traditional two parties no longer fit for purpose. Because the only way you can address these energy releases is no longer on a left-right spectrum, but with what I call, the way nature does, with complex adaptive coalitions, where business, labor, educators, philanthropists, social entrepreneurs, and government all work together to create solutions. I'll give you a tiny example. I was in Israel 2 years ago, right before the pandemic, and I went to see a company there called Mobileye. Mobileye, it's an Israeli autonomous driving company that was sold to Intel for $14 billion. Well, the CEO asked me, Amnon Shashua, he said, Tom, have you ever driven in a self-driving car? I said, Amnon, I was just at Google in Mountain View, California, and I drove in their self-driving car. He said, Mountain View. That's a grid. Try driving in a self-driving car in Jerusalem, where there are no two parallel streets. So I tried it. I went up there. We drove around, up, down, sideways, camels, donkeys, I mean, everything. Israelis, Palestinians, and no one was driving. It was amazing. Well, he told me a very interesting story afterwards. That is, to test a self-driving car in Israel, you need an insurance protocol that determines what constitutes safe self-driving. Well, it turns out the rabbis who run Jerusalem don't know anything about self-driving cars. So Amnon had to convene a complex adaptive coalition of Volkswagen, Mobileye, the rabbis who run Jerusalem, and the Israeli Ministry of Transportation, and they collaboratively wrote the law. It's so good that Yandex, Russia's Google, now tests their self-driving cars in Israel. And China just took the whole Israeli law, translated it into Chinese, and made it their law. Who is left and who is right in this story? There's no left and there's no right, okay? More and more problems in this world we're in now have no left and no right. They can only be addressed by complex adaptive coalitions. And that's what brings us to education. Because when the roof was, when the ceiling was blown off and the walls were blown down and the floor was crashed through, we made the world really fast. The pace of change is now really fast. It made the world really fused. More and more people are being fused together by migration and technology than ever before. It made the world really deep. Did you notice we had to add the adjective deep to everything now? Deep fake, deep mind, deep research, deep medicine. That's because technology is going so deep, so fast, you governments don't even know where it is. We had a hearing here in America a few years ago where a US senator asked Mark Zuckerberg, Mr. Zuckerberg, if you give your product away for free, how do you make money? The regulator had no idea how the innovator even makes money anymore. The world got fast, fused, deep, dual. Everything is dual use now. My toaster has a chip in it. It's made in China. Is the People's Liberation Army listening to me when I toast my bagel every morning? I don't know. Everything is dual use. Fast, fused, deep, dual, open. The world got radically open. One of us can now talk to all of us. And we can hear each other whisper now. We can hear each other whisper. I'm in New York City, And I'm whispering to an audience in Paris. Fast, fused, deep, dual, open, and really fragile. We connected every node in the world, and then we took out the buffers. So instability in one node, like a virus, can now get transmitted to the whole system faster than ever. Well, this is a huge governing challenge, but let's conclude with it's a huge education challenge. Because when the world is this fast, think about what happens to skills. In the 1700 Promethean moment, when we got the steam engine, average lifespan for males was 37 years. Well, the steam engine lasted for about 100 years as the main tool. That meant 3 generations of males basically worked with the same tool. In the 1800s, with the combustion engine electrification, life expectancy went to 40 years. That means 2.5 generations basically worked with the same tool. Today, with the pace of change as it is, everything can change in 5 years. It means in my lifetime, in my work time, I may deal with 10 different technology tools driving education. So that is a huge training, skills, and education challenge for everyone now. The world is getting fast and even faster. And basically what happens is, in my view, the only way we can manage this is through complex adaptive coalitions. So let me again give you an example. We had a story here you probably read about a few years ago, where these parents in Hollywood hired this guy to bribe to get their children into USC University and several others. I wanted to call those parents and say, hey, come here for a second. If you're going to bribe to get your kids into a university, can I suggest you bribe to get them into IBM's in-house university? Because if I showed you IBM's in-house university, it would blow your mind. It would blow your mind. You wouldn't be bothering with USC. Well, what's that about? What that's about is IBM wakes up every morning in this fast world, knows that it's competing with Amazon and Google and Microsoft, and it doesn't have time to wait for the Minister of Education in your countries to figure out whether they should teach TensorFlow 3.0 the second that it comes out. So what all these big companies are doing are building their own in-house university platforms. And if I showed you Infosys platform or IBM's, it would blow your mind. And these platforms are all based on just-in-time learning, not just-in-case learning. They're built on just-in-time learning, not built on just-in-case learning. So if you go to IBM's platform, what will you find? You'll find a complex adaptive coalition. You'll find courses that IBM has developed itself for its workers. You'll find IBM employees teaching their own courses on the very tip of the spear they're now inventing. You'll find education platforms that are being made available to IBM workers, like Khan Academy, and you will find IBM employees able to take advantage of traditional university classrooms for not just in time learning, but just in case learning, which is also very important, whether it's humanities or other things. So IBM employees on any given day can choose between an IBM course taught by one of the IBM employees who's actually just invented something and teaching his fellow employees about it. A private online platform specializing in some skill, and then traditional universities. That's the dashboard they're giving their employees, because IBM's motto today is skills first. So they have created a new rubric inside the company that you will be promoted on the basis of 2 things. One is your contribution to profitability, and second, on your learnability. Your ability to deepen your own knowledge and your ability to seek out new knowledge. They call that skills first. And because IBM has moved to a skills first platform, today 50%, 50, of jobs on IBM's IBM platform, this is help wanted jobs, 50 50% of IBM jobs no longer require a BA. 50% of jobs at IBM no longer require a BA. All they require are you to demonstrate that you have the skills and the learnability in order to acquire one of these jobs. That's how fast this is going. So basically, in this kind of fast world, if you can't develop a complex adaptive coalition between businesses, labor, educators, non-traditional education platforms, you're never going to be able to keep up. The days when the Minister of Education for one of your countries could just decide from the top down the learning agenda and curriculum for all your schools and expect that's going to serve your business community, if you're not every day asking your businesses, what are you needing? How is it changing? How are you educating your people? And how do we create a complex adaptive coalition with you? You're just never going to be able to keep up. Now, let me just add a couple of other things that I think are particularly important, though, in this education, because obviously you need these technological skills. But there's two things that I've seen, speaking about America, that we really have to focus on energizing the education around. The first is civics. Civics. What we've seen in America is we have a generation that does not know how democracy works. It doesn't know how our government works. It doesn't know how our institutions work. And we got a real shock this year of what happens when people don't understand the basic elements of your democratic institutions. When I went to school, we were taught civics. That's no longer part of education. Now, we had a year-long civics. How does the Congress work? How does the Supreme Court work? And I think going back to teaching civics is hugely important. The other thing, and Andreas alluded to this, is that because the world's getting so fused, we are now being fused together with people so much stranger than we are than ever before. And from so many different places and so many different cultures. My aunt and uncle, I grew up in Minnesota, and I had an aunt and uncle who lived in a small town in central Minnesota called Wilmer. And I never forget, in 1975, my aunt came down to Minneapolis, where the capital where I live, and said to me one day, "Tom, I have to tell you, I was in the grocery store the other day and I heard someone speaking Spanish. Spanish. She heard someone speaking Spanish in 1975. It was her first encounter with the other. Well, today I visited Wilmer, Minnesota 2 years ago. I wrote a story about it. Wilmer, Minnesota today is 50% Somali and Latino. This is a town in west central Minnesota. It went from, in 1975, my aunt hearing someone speaking Spanish and thinking she had moved to the moon, to a town today that is 50% Somali and Latino. And if you are a small town in Minnesota today and you cannot embrace inclusion, you will die, because all your young people are leaving. And so the necessity to educate for inclusion and pluralism in order to thrive today as a country is going to be more and more important. So let me conclude by, because people always ask me this, Andreas asked me this, what do I tell my own kids? What do I tell them? I have two girls. What do I tell my own kids? Well, this is what I used to tell my girls. They're sick of hearing it, but you're all fresh meat, so I'll test it out on you. I basically tell my girls 5 things when it comes to education. Rule number 1, always think like an immigrant. Always think like a new immigrant. How does the new immigrant think? The new immigrant thinks, I just showed up here in Paris, and there's no legacy spot waiting for me at Sciences Po, okay? I better figure out what's going on here. What are the greatest economic opportunities, and pursue them with more energy and vigor than anybody else. New immigrants are always paranoid optimists. They left somewhere bad to come to somewhere they thought would be better, okay? And the thing about new immigrants is that they always stay hungry. And we need to be new immigrants. All our kids need to be, because we are all new immigrants to this new Promethean moment. So first of all, always think like an immigrant. Second, think like an artisan. Who is the artisan? The artisan was that person in the Middle Ages who basically produced everything one-off, everything individually. So the artisan produced every shoe, every table, every chair, every plate, every fork, every chandelier, every saddle, every stirrup, every boot, every candle individually. And what did the best artisans do? They brought so much personal extra to what they were doing, to what they were building. They brought so much personal extra to it that they carved their initials into it at the end of the day. We still see that in silverware produced by artisans. Do your job every day as if you bring so much human extra to it, you want to carve your initials into it at the end of the day, because that's a job that can never be outsourced, automated, and digitized. Think like an artisan. Third, I tell my girls, think like a starter up in Silicon Valley. I got this idea from Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn. Reid likes to say in Silicon Valley, there's only one four-letter word. There's only one four-letter word. It's actually not 4 letters, but it does start with an F. And that word is finished. Finished. If you ever think of yourself as a finished product, you will be finished. Always think of yourself, Reid says, as being in the state of beta. Beta is the state of development of a piece of software where it's about 80% done, and then they throw it out to the community. They find all the holes, all the fixes, they work on it some more, they throw it back over the wall, they work on it some more, they send another beta version over, the community tests it, fixes it, finds the holes, they throw it back. Always be in beta in whatever job you're doing. Never think of yourself as finished, otherwise you really will be finished. Fourth, always remember that CQ plus PQ is always greater than IQ. You give me a young person with a high curiosity quotient and a high passion quotient, and I'll take them over a kid with a high intelligence quotient every day of the week. In an age where passion, curiosity, and agency will be so important, instilling more CQ and PQ and worrying less about IQ, I think will be essential to education. And lastly, always think like a waitress at Perkins Pancake House in Minneapolis, my favorite restaurant growing up. I was back home in Minneapolis working on a book recently, and I went to breakfast on a Sunday morning at Perkins Pancake House, my favorite restaurant. I was with my friend Ken. I ordered scrambled eggs and bacon, and he ordered scrambled eggs and fruit. Well, the waitress, we were basically the only ones in the restaurant that early, and she went and back in the kitchen, came out after 15 minutes, put our 2 plates down. All she said to my friend Ken was, "I gave you extra fruit. I gave you extra fruit." I gave her a 50% tip, because what was that waitress doing? She was acting entrepreneurially. She figured, I got these 2 guys here, nobody else is in the restaurant. She controlled the fruit ladle. I'm going to give this guy some extra fruit, see what happens. Well, it turns out I noticed, and I gave her a 50% tip. That waitress was behaving entrepreneurially. You want to instill in your young people, whatever they're doing, whether they're in education, going into technology, going into taking care of the elderly. Always think entrepreneurially. How can I fork off and find a new job here, a new opportunity, a new industry? So if you take nothing else from this talk, please take away this. Always think like an artisan and take pride. Always think like an immigrant and stay hungry. Always think like a starter-upper in Silicon Valley and never think of yourself as finished. Remember that CQ plus PQ will always be greater than IQ, and always, always think like a waitress at Perkins Pancake House and be relentlessly entrepreneurial, because this Minnesota boy can tell you we all really do live in an age where average is officially over. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. As always, you blew our minds, like no one else. You can bring people to this outer edge of, where the best learning happens, the edge of human behavior, the edge of technology, and Mother Nature, exactly the three frontiers that will be on our agenda tomorrow. I welcome our moderator, my dear colleague, Hikya Parata, former education minister in New Zealand. And Hikya has this magic grace to create amazing discussions among strangers and build complex adaptive coalitions and to make every minute count. Hikya, over to you.
Kia ora, bonjour, good afternoon, hi, and welcome to this forum. I would just like to endorse Andreas's thanks to Tom Friedman. I follow him in the New York Times from the other side of the world in New Zealand, and I'm always inspired. But today, Tom, it's been way past inspiration. And I really appreciate that not only have you drawn together or synthesized these experiences of yours, but you've explained them in ways that are, yes, potentially challenges, but absolute invitations to ministers. I particularly loved, as a former Minister of Education, you telling us emphatically nobody is waiting around for us to make a decision about the specifics of a curriculum or the specifics of a schooling network. So thank you for charging us with that energy and making sure that we understand we are in a Promethean moment. It's brilliant. Thank you.